All right, welcome. Welcome to everybody who's watching and listening. This is one of multiple episodes of me, Dr. Ashwin Mehta, and Dr. Taryn Hess in conversation about a paper we've written on data literacy in the age of generative AI. So, Taryn, welcome.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here. We've been talking about this for a while. Obviously, we're both very passionate about this, so looking forward to one of many good conversations that we've already had, and now we can share that out with everybody.
Absolutely. So the context for us writing a paper together. So I was giving a speech in Brandon Hall, I think, and I was talking about in Florida, and I was talking about data literacy and data being the fuel for the AI engine, and data being the thing that allows us to demonstrate impact, and data literacy being something that has been potentially lacking over the years in various pockets of the world, but something that is going to need to be focused upon in the new age, in the AI revolution. And that's kind of how we met, and that started this journey of writing a paper together. So let me open that part of the conversation. Data literacy, what does it mean to you, and how important do you think it is?
Man, so when I think so a few perspectives on that. One, personally, when I think about data, it is such an important part of everything that I do as a person, right? And what I think about, and when I'm working with a client, when I'm working on my own things, when I'm even day to day looking at, does it make more sense to buy this thing or that thing, and comparing apples to apples and looking at different grocery stores. So fundamentally, data is the fuel to making decisions, and it's the fuel to thinking critically about whatever it might be. Again, personal life, professional life, helping others. So it's so important. When I think about it then in terms of like industry, and I'm thinking about learning people and instructional designers and the education system and even technology, learning technology, it is an area where we've been lacking a bit, if we're being honest. There's so much opportunity there to think about data and to leverage it better to be able to make, again, those decisions on what does the next phase of life look like with AI, especially when you're talking about learning. So it's so important. And then when you break that down even further, yes, having the skills and the knowledge and the abilities to use data is important. So the literacy part of it. But then you have to, there's this piece of mindset and the human piece of it. So you have to be able to not just, yes, have those skill sets, but put it first, put data first, ask for data, demand data, use data, think about data all the time. So yes, knowledge, skills, ability around data and being able to use it to communicate effectively, and especially within context. So all of those pieces, all of that, which was not a succinct definition, but all of that is what data literacy means to me.
Yeah, I think you raised an interesting point there. And the point is that we talk about data literacy in the context of work. We talk about it in the context of learning and development and human capital management and basically the value chain of a business. But it's not just about business, it's about life. And that's the point that you make that made me think about so many stories. But I remember I grew up in Liverpool in the UK. And I don't know if this is indicative of the entirety of the UK, but I regularly had conversations with people where they would say, you know what? They would almost say it as a badge of honor to say that I'm terrible at maths. I'm not very good at this. And I'm more interested, and it's fine for people to be interested in these things, but I'm more interested in doing practical things. And I think at the time I was thinking that anybody can be interested in anything. That's all cool. But to wear something as a badge of honor that you're bad at didn't make sense to me. And it never really resonated with me or my culture or my upbringing. But that kind of thing translates through to modern day, right? In my life, again, I go down to the supermarket down the road. I won't name them because, but I go down to the supermarket down the road and they have these aisles, and you have like the cooked meat or the cheese aisle. And if you go down the aisle, you have smaller packages, larger packages, and they're all like priced appropriately. And then you got to get to the end of the aisle and you have like a multi-buy. Buy 2 of this package size for a particular amount of money. And those are the ones that go because they're on the end. Product placement in a supermarket is a thing. But if you stop for a second and you look at the data that's in front of you, the number of grams you're getting for the number of pennies you are spending, it's nearly always better value to go down into the aisle and pick things out of the aisle. And part of me wonders again, is this the art and the science of product placement in a physical space? Or is this people not really looking at the data? Or is it people not really understanding the data? So I think your point about this being a life skill rather than just being a business skill, I think is so important when we think about data literacy. So
it's the human factor to this, right? Marketing people know what they're doing. Product placement, they know what they're doing completely. It's the 2 for 1 or like buy 2 get 1, whatever it might be, that we think we're getting so much more. And yeah, agreed. So they're tapping into that human side of us that's thinking we're getting more than we really are. But we have to think critically. Oh my gosh. I do that all the time. Sometimes I give in and I'm like, oh yeah, I got a deal. But then other times I'm like, wait, let me actually do the math, which takes like very little time, but let me do it. And then I'm like, whoa, that's actually more money to buy. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
Completely.
But interesting, marketing. So I had one of these conversations with a marketing person, maybe I'm going to say 3 weeks ago, something like that. And we were having this conversation about marketing and learning are not that different in terms of what they do. So you have the concept of I'm going to make some media, and through that media, I hope to change behavior, whether it's the purchasing behavior of a customer or a consumer, or whether it is the behavior of an employee in a workplace. The idea is that you hope through intervention, through doing something, and usually that's digital media, you hope that the behavior will change and you'll get some kind of impact, some kind of revenue or sale kind of behavior. Which is interesting because if we think about both of those in terms of data now, and data literacy is the topic that we're discussing, then both of those professions kind of rely on the idea of traffic metrics, vanity metrics. So how many people passed through my website? How many people clicked on the particular thing that I put out there? And that's not the same as thinking about success metrics or success criteria or performance indicators for the problem that you're trying to solve with the intervention that you put forward. And I don't know if that's a culture issue or if it's a data literacy issue or if it's just sometimes data is difficult to collect. We don't have the sources. We have to put effort into it. But I wonder how much of this kind of paradigm that I'm describing in marketing and learning, where there is the need to do things differently to demonstrate different outcomes, I wonder how much of that paradigm touches other parts of the business. So we have the functional parts of businesses like, IT and security and safety and quality and these kinds of things, sustainability. But we also have product teams. Most businesses either have a product or a service, and they sell that product or service and they make money from it. So in your experience, how widespread is the potential issue around data literacy and the use of data?
I think it's desperate. So I think depending on the industry, depending on the role that you have within a company, within an industry, it's very widespread to me. So when I think about, if I'm pulling it back into when I think about L&D types of roles, a lot of time, as you said, almost like a vanity metric, right? Like, do people attend my workshop kind of thing? Well, okay, that's important to know if they showed up, right? Because fundamentally, if they're not there, they can't be engaged. You can't change behavior if they aren't just showing up. The part that I always see, at least again, just within this context, is the follow-up. Did they adopt it? Was it useful? Am I looking at it 30, 60, 90, 120 days out? Those are the things that don't always get measured. So, but why not? Why aren't they getting measured? We should go out and measure them. We should look at what's really happening on the ground. Well, often times we aren't allowed to do that. We're just frankly cut off. We're told, okay, build this training for me and go do this thing. And then the business takes it from there. So it needs to be a conversation. It needs to be a partnership between both areas in order to truly get at metrics that matter. Let's look at performance. Let's look at adoption. Let's look at our behaviors actually changing. So going beyond those vanity metrics and looking at actual change. So again, that takes a shift. It takes a shift in that partnership. It takes a shift in understanding the value that someone in an L&D role can provide after the fact. They're not there to just build the training, to facilitate it maybe for you, or to launch it for you if it's an e-learning or some type of media. They need to be there to see, did it work, so they can make adjustments. So, some steps towards that could be piloting, actually doing a real pilot and getting the feedback and then growing it from there and then seeing how that cultivates and changes the ultimate behaviors of those people. This is just one context. If you think about that, though, with groups of people who are used to using data, they're probably more comfortable with it. They're going to have those conversations. They're going to look at metrics and build out metrics and get the data that they need, or at least understand the data that they need better to be able to make those changes. So for me, it's really dependent on your role and traditionally whether you use data and whether you're allowed to use data. Because again, a lot of people within some kind of education capacity aren't even allowed to talk to people after the fact. They're kind of cut off. So we have to shift, and that's where that mindset piece comes in, right? You have to shift mindset, and then from there, you have to shift process. You have to shift the types of data we're allowed to share with each other, even. So some of that, we often get to, and we talk about data as an enterprise asset. That's real, and that should happen. Now, you obviously have to protect some data. There's some personal data that we can't just share out with everybody, or maybe there's some business data that can't be shared out, but we have to shift some things, to me, in order to make it real and to make it data, to take the full advantage of the data that we have.
Yeah. So I think there are two parts to what you just said. So the first part is, what is the role of L&D when it comes to data? And the second part is, how do we therefore apply either a taxonomy or a hierarchy or a classification to data such that it is useful for L&D? Because probably that's the target audience that we're looking at, and that's what we've been investigating in our paper. So the first part, the role of L&D. Now, I've always thought that the role of L&D is, you have in a population, in a workforce, you have effectively normally distributed performance. People. You talk about people in a population, whatever parameter we're looking at is going to be not normally distributed, most likely, or some approximation of that. And the role of L&D for me is that not necessarily to look at the top performers and look at the lowest percentile or anything, but to move the mean. So you have the mean in a normally distributed curve, and you want to move that mean, gain 5 or 10% in terms of performance. Probably leave the top performers where they are because they're doing well, but try and move everybody else a little bit. And usually we do that through interventions. Now, the interventions themselves will have, again, probably a data profile. So we think about interventions in the academic or scientific world, and we tend to think about, like you were saying, so repeated measures or time series studies where you would take a measure and the person is their own control. Or you might be thinking about A/B testing, pre and post testing, anything like that, where you compare two groups. And I don't think I've not seen a lot of that in the L&D industry over the years that I've been working in the L&D industry. But really, we're looking at, if my role is to move the mean in terms of performance, and I'm going to do that through interventions, then I need to be able to understand how to run an experimental study such that my intervention, the impact of my intervention, can somehow be demonstrated. And everything I've just said requires a certain amount of data literacy to understand what I've said, right? Have you seen this kind of thinking or this kind of approach to experimental impact through learning interventions? Have you seen that anywhere?
So a couple of thoughts came to mind as soon as you were describing that in terms of moving the mean. One thought, and then I'm going to answer what you're just asking around looking at interventions to drive this and building out a design in terms of really truly it's testing, as you said, being experimental with learning. But in order to move that mean too, another way to look at it to drive to make that happen is raising the lowest common denominator, getting everybody on the same page. So fundamentally saying, where is my threshold from a data literacy standpoint, regardless of the role, right? So another area that you and I talk about a lot is HR. So HR is so impactful when it comes to making this happen across an organization. They have the ability for them to do that, especially when it comes to helping support from a career and a full employee life cycle standpoint, is really, really powerful and really impactful. It can be, but raising that lowest common denominator, then you're raising the mean at the same time. Like, let's get everyone to here, and then you're pushing this up a bit, because then people can talk to each other, which is really important. I know that sounds very fundamental, but it's so important. From a experimentation, a research-based approach to thinking about growing skills, growing knowledge, growing abilities, we do this on a regular basis. We build in pilots, as I mentioned briefly, to see, is this content going to work for our target audience? We build out profiles. Who is the target audience? Who are we looking at? What skills do they already have? Where's their maturity in terms of those skills that we're trying to target for them? Often what we find is that, and as you were describing, you've got a range of people, even within a target audience. Well, then how do I support all of them? And sometimes that means looking at building out different pathways or different roles for different people. Maybe you build out mentorships. Maybe you build in group activities and interventions that people with more advanced skills help support people that are maybe more green, newer to this concept that you're trying to get them to do. You build that out, build out a pilot, and collect data. Do surveys, talk to the people, literally talk to them, have office hours, get their insight on whether or not this is making an impact for them. It could be immediate, it may take longer, but get through that period of piloting the content, piloting the experience itself, then go through the content, go through the feedback rather, and the content at the same time, and say, okay, some of this is going to be one-off. Some of it is preferential. Some people are going to come back and say, oh, I hated the tone of that speaker. Okay, maybe we switch out the speaker, right? Like if you get down to the nitty-gritty. Or did it strike them in such a, the content strike them in such a way that they are now changing their behavior? Well, guess what? Then maybe I don't mind the tone being a little off, because as long as they're changing their behavior, whether it made them comfortable or uncomfortable, you know, I don't necessarily care. This might sound bad. If they're happy at the end of a training, I want to know, did it make a change for them? Do they see things in a different way? Are they looking at data now from a different perspective? Are they using data? Are they talking about data? Are they talking about the challenges? Are they thinking critically? That's going to be hard. It's going to make you uncomfortable. So you may not be happy, right? But if you're changing your behavior in a way that's going to positively, long haul, right? Maybe in short term too, impact your day-to-day activities, the business itself, that's what I want to see. So maybe not an A to B study, right? Because that might be a little rough to do when it comes to learning. But in terms of piloting things out, absolutely. And then you have to keep iterating on that as much as you can within the space that you're allowed. Sometimes you can't do that, as we also talked about before. You told, push this thing out, let it be. Check in the box, right? But yes, absolutely. We do our best for the most part. We pilot out content, we get that feedback, we have a conversation around what do we prioritize in terms of what we've seen, what we hear, and then what tweaks do we need to make in order to continue to refine this experience for people. Because again, it's not just learning, it's an experience we want them to have. We want them bought in. We need to understand the benefits and the why for us in order to change that behavior. So to do that, we have to make adjustments along the way. and it never stops. It's really a living thing. So, quick
Yeah,
answer, yes. A to B experiment.
but that's
I have
that's the
not done.
difference between. I mean, this is the business reality, right? Where sometimes you have stakeholders, they want a thing, and you implement the thing, and then you ask them if they're happy, and that's not the same as finding out data from your population of users, your learners, and figuring out if it made a difference. And I agree that you don't, you can be unhappy and have learned something. I mean, that's. I think there was a book that I read. It'll be somewhere on one of my shelves. There's a book that I read. It was something like Adventures in the Margin of Error, and I forget who the author was, but they were saying something along the lines of the most memorable lessons in our life is when we've been wrong. So you don't have to be happy to learn something, and yet the base layer of Kirkpatrick that the entire industry is probably familiar with indicates that we need to collect whether or not people were happy. Did they find the room comfortable? Were they happy with the sandwiches? And that gives us a measure of, was this a good course to run? So it flies in the face of what we know, right?
Absolutely. It even makes me think, even from a marketing standpoint, you'll go into a place and they've got some places have those indicators like the happy face, the like indifferent face, and then the frowny face. It's like, I mean, was it useful? Was it easy to get through? Like, did I find my experience valuable to me? I know that's hard to put in frowny faces. That's the kind of stuff that makes an impact. Like, did my behavior change? Did I get something positive out of it other than, I walked away feeling jovial? Like, yes, we have to start thinking different about how we approach what we measure and look at it in terms of that long term. What are the business goals that I'm trying to achieve here? If
Yes.
I'm trying to get people to use this new tool because at the end of the day, it can save us millions of dollars or pounds or whatever currency you want to put it in, because it has so much ability to drive efficiencies and effectiveness and it's going to help with communication. Well, do I care if they're happy initially? I don't know.
Yeah. I would love for the L&D industry as a whole to be more empowered to say no to things rather than being an order taker, to be able to say, well, we're trying to solve a business problem. That business problem is rooted in, we have evidence, we have data that says that there's a problem here, and maybe it is or it isn't a human factors problem. And if it is a human factors problem, then we have an intervention and we can try and measure the things that we're measuring now. We can measure those after the intervention and see if there's been a delta, or has there been a difference. And if we know from the data that this is not a human factors piece, then let's not just throw training at it and hope that we fix the problem. So that conversation it's emerging as the concept of performance consulting. But I would love that to be an empowering and a strong conversation in businesses, because there's possibly lots of money and time being wasted on things that are not really human factors issues.
Completely agree. It makes me think of, and I don't know if we want to go there yet, but it makes me think of the framework that you have around data literacy. So yes, we know data is important. We know that we need to start looking at it more. We know there's opportunities for us to shift our mindset, to look at it in a different way, to look at the metrics differently and align that better with our vision, our goal, our purpose. Because fundamentally, this has to be grounded in a purpose and a direction so that we're headed in, the same way, right? Everyone's going towards the same direction. You can have some offshoots, sure, but like we're walking towards the cafeteria for lunch kind of thing.
Yeah.
When we break that down, what are the skills that we say people need? Like when we say data literacy, right? And we talked about this is an ability to communicate effectively with data in context. What does that mean for people? Okay, we get that, but like, what are those specific things that we now need to start looking at from the lens of data literacy? What are the different concepts that people need to have?
So I'll throw a little bit of context on that. So we do have a model in the paper, and the model in the paper, I started looking at that because I was looking into AI literacy, and AI literacy is something that is going to be very, very important in 2025. It's part of the EU AI Act to ensure the literacy of people who are using AI systems. And I was looking into that, and we had this concept. We were already talking about this about a year ago, you and I, where data being the fuel for the AI engine, and that makes it more and more important in the value chain of businesses. But what does data literacy look like? So you have data literacy, digital literacy, and AI literacy, and all of these things kind of link together. And digital literacy is obviously related to devices a little bit. Whereas data literacy doesn't have to have a device associated with it, because data can live in the ether, it can live in servers, it can live on the cloud. It still needs to somehow be managed. And then you have AI literacy, which may or may not be related to digital or data literacy, but there's an overlap between each of these three things. And in that overlap, we need to ensure not only these three concepts all have appropriate literacy in the workforce, but also the overlap pieces are also being addressed in some way. So that led me to develop the data literacy framework or approach that's in the paper. And I'll run through that ever so quickly, but the context also, we need to be mindful of the emerging data picture in workforce data. So the big consulting firms and the big data houses and the big tech firms are all publishing data regularly that is saying that data literacy and AI literacy are related to increased employability. They're related to transformation. Businesses want these skills, and therefore those skills attract the premium. So that's part of the context as well. I don't know if, Taryn, before I go into the framework itself, would you like to comment on the importance to a person, to businesses, of data literacy?
So I completely agree. Looking at the research, both of us have our own perspective on this, and a lot of that is grounded in what we've read, the research we've seen, the experiences that we have working with clients, and then obviously our own personal take on this. Clearly skewed towards data and it being important, if that's not clear.
Yeah.
The research, though, is astoundingly geared towards this. Like, data and AI skills are the number one skill set for large organizations. I think that was the World Economic Forum that put that out there. When you couple that with all of the other data we've seen around data, I think it's different CEOs. There was a report by, and I'm going to mess this up, of course, but there's a report, and we can share all of the references are in our article, our white paper. But we can share this out as well. Is there's a ton of CEOs that recognize data skills specifically being just as important as computer skills. I mean, when you think about that, and just that alone, how important computer skills were in the internet and how that changed the world. And if that's, data skills are being compared to computer skills, and then you throw AI on top of it, you throw all this digitalization on top of that, it's paramount. Like, cannot ignore this. If you can't now. You have to figure out how to do this and where your company is at in their journey. So there's some companies that are much more mature in this space than others, and that is okay. You just need to know where you're at so that you can then build out your roadmap, right? As I was saying, getting us all to go to the cafeteria together. You got to figure out your roadmap and your pathway to get there. It's the research is resounding towards this is such an important thing. We cannot ignore it anymore. AI is not going away, which fundamentally, as you're describing, is linked to data, is linked to digitalization. So those three things you have to look at them. Like, there's no way around it at this point, and you have to work with your different people within your organization. You may have a CDO, CHRO, all of the people within your organization. There's somebody right now working on a strategy and a vision towards this. Get with them, talk with them, get it aligned, and start to figure out where you're at on your journey so you can then start using these things that we're describing in the white paper to build out your plan. So yes, just lots of icing and whipped cream and cherries on the top of what you said.
And I don't think any field is really exempt from this, because even if we think about the obvious counterpoint is always, well, what about a construction site, right? And Construction sites are actually very data heavy because you have, of course, calculations around what is load bearing and what isn't, architectural plans, all of these things are data. You have safety passports for workers, all of these things are data. So there's not really any getting away from it. I think every field has a dependency on data. But I'll talk about the model. So big picture, in L&D, we want to be considering two things. So one is the skill set and the literacy of the L&D teams themselves, such that they can use the data that they have to demonstrate impact, to demonstrate performance, and to demonstrate that interventions are worth doing. And then there is mobilizing the workforce such that the workforce has sufficient literacy to do the things that the workforce needs to do. So if you're in manufacturing, the workforce can understand data related to manufacturing. If you're in legal, then your workforce can understand data related to law. So all of these things are, we should think about the framework in two ways. What does the L&D team need, and how does the L&D team mobilize the workforce? So the model itself starts with data concepts. So what are data concepts? Well, what is data? Everything that we've discussed so far in conversation, we talk around data and understanding what actually is data, structured and unstructured, different formats of data, numerical through to prose and narrative. All of these things are data, and it's important to understand what in your sphere is data. And part of that is also to understand statistics about data. So even text, even large amounts of prose and essays and things like that will have statistics about it. So theme analysis, for example, or sentiment analysis around text can be borne out in a statistical way. And then what are the outputs of either the data that you have when you start to get insight, or what are the outputs of the statistical methods that you're using to try and demonstrate things? These three things, roughly speaking, are the data concepts. And there are other data concepts out there, but it depends on what you're doing. But these three things are pretty much foundational across nearly every aspect of business. And then running through a typical experimental approach, really. So once you understand what data is, how do you collect data? Where do you get it from? How do you find out new sources of data? How do you sample versus being exhaustive about the data that you're collecting? And how do you ensure the quality of the sources of the data that you are using? Are they robust? Are they reliable? Are they valid? Can you, to some degree, demonstrate that with potentially statistical tests or benchmarks? Then you have management of data. Where's your data? How is it stored? How is it organized? How is it handled? Where is it kept? Is there metadata around it? Is it tagged? So all of this would be the management of data. Then we think about the application of data. So how do you use data for strategy, to modify strategies? Evidence-based, data-driven. These are terms that I'm sure everybody has heard thousands and thousands of times over the last few years. We take an evidence-based approach. Great. What does that mean? Where is the data? How do we modify our strategies based on the evidence that we have? How does it bear in terms of culture? Does cultural transformation happen when we are presented with data that indicates an approach or a particular way of working isn't happening? It's not working. It's not delivering value. So, or do we confirm that the things that we are doing are correct and therefore continue down that journey? And also data criticality forms part of that, because there's so much data. Some of it's very important, some of it just isn't. Correlation and causation, for example. These are the kinds of things that you need to be understanding when you're saying that the price of butter in Oklahoma really affects my strategy for learning in the UK, right? Those two bits of data just aren't related to each other at all. And then we have evaluation. So how do we analyze, get insights, and then make decisions based on the data that we have? So as a framework or as an approach, these are the different categories that I would say that L&D teams need to have some level of data literacy in those areas. And when you're mobilizing a workforce to use AI, to use data, to be innovative, to go digital, then all of these areas are going to be an important part of basic literacy in the workforce. So that's the model. Taryn, what do you think? Did I forget anything?
So the 1+1, or like add-on, that I would have to this would be yes, you have to go through the full process. And really the scientific method, right? You need to go through every single step and not just go through it, understand it, and be able to leverage data throughout it and to think critically about it. So that umbrella concept of critical thinking, you have to apply in every single step as you're going through it. The plus one and one for any of our basketball fans out there would be communication. You have
Yes.
to communicate. So, yes, you can go through that whole process. You can be really good at your analysis. You can have some amazing visualizations, or you think they're amazing visualizations. That's a whole other thing we can talk about, right? Visualizing the data that you're trying to communicate. But at the end of the day, if you can't communicate out what your vision is, and I shouldn't use vision, right? Because we're using that as that purpose driven thing, but what you are trying to convey to your audience, if you can't do that, it doesn't matter how good your data is. It doesn't matter if it's high quality. It doesn't matter if you've done the most amazing statistical analyses out there and you are pulling out your SPSS software from grad school and you have this down. If you can't communicate it out, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Right? It doesn't matter, which gets us back to the grocery store, where when you put it on the end cap of the aisle and people see that $2, $4, $5 or whatever it is, and they are like, oh yes, this is it for me. That's communicating. So I would add that on top of this, right? It could be umbrella, like the critical thinking piece, but it's almost like the glue that binds all of this, those two C's together. So that's the only thing I would add is you have to be able to critically think. Again, that was already through that, but the communication piece, you have to be able to take your data and talk to the right people. You have to do it in a way that's going to drive buy-in and get you meaningful action, whatever it might be. So if we talk about L&D a lot because we come from that industry, right? So if you're trying to change the behaviors of your people that are going through the program that you've created, you need to be able to appeal to them, right? And you need to be able to appeal to their stakeholders. If you are in an HR role and you are trying to get your whoever to start thinking about how do we approach our entire talent acquisition, all of it, all of TA, or maybe even if you're looking at career progression through our organization, how do we support our employees through their life cycle? And I recognize that skills are the way to do it. I need to show data on it, and I need to be able to communicate that effectively to get that buy-in. Communication, critical thinking plus communication as like an umbrella thing to support all of those pieces, I think are really, really important.
I mean that's been the great thing about our year together, right? Working on this paper, that we have. So in the model, we do have things like insight and communicating insight for decision making. But the purpose of us collaborating was that your model deals with culture, leadership, and communication, and some of these other things. And the other couple of bits, such as the data literacy framework, plug so nicely into the model that you have, that overarching model that allows us to think about sustainable cultural transformation. That synergy has allowed us to really, really put this stuff into writing. So it's really good that you mentioned that, because it's good that both of our approaches are dovetailing into adding value, which I really like.
Agree. Yes,
So
I completely agree.
we've gone through a model. We've talked about the importance of data literacy and the different facets of that. The rest of our paper, which we have other conversations about that we've recorded, touches on not only the model that we've just described, so an overarching framework for this, data literacy we've just talked about, but also a strategic approach for AI and data implementation, which brings the three parts of the paper basically together to give some actionable takeaways for folks in the L&D industry to really think about data literacy in the age of generative AI. Anything I've missed? Does that seem fairly all-encompassing?
I think we've caught it all. So just, I keep having these like plus ones, success factors around all of this,
Yes,
right? It's really, really
not the
important to think
LMS.
about that. Yes, yeah, it's so important to think about that. We have learned a lot along our journeys, and there's lots of things that we want to share. We can't even cover them all in the paper or in our podcast series right now. So obviously we want to have continued conversations with lots of people out there. So whoever's listening in, please contact us. We'd love to speak with you. So lessons learned, tips and tricks, things to consider as you're going along your journey. I mean, we've also been describing, this is not a one and done. This is something you're going to have to continue to look at. AI is going to continue to evolve. And as that evolves, the data with it will, digitalization with it will with it. And then also your mindset, your approach to how you handle that has to evolve with it. So yes, that's my plus one there.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, but I would say that. So I was giving a couple of end of year kind of talks and writing a little bit around the end of the year. And I think the 25 is going to be an interesting year, but it's going to rest, I think, more on AI literacy than data literacy. But the two can't really be separated too much because, as we've said, AI needs data. So I think data literacy is going to be very, very important. And to echo what you said, I think generally speaking, L&D teams should be examining what they have in terms of their own literacy and skills and what the organization needs. And that will vary by sector. But we have written a paper. Go and read it. And contact us if you want to talk about any of the things that we have mentioned in these conversations, in the podcast side of things, anything that you read on the paper, or you just want to discuss and want to know more about what your approach should be for data literacy and AI literacy, then drop us a note. See you soon.
Thank you. Bye.